Conversations this morning. Is there a public policy crisis on our hands? Well, one political leader believes that Trinidad and Tobago's crime situation is not a public health crisis, but more so a public policy issue. And that is Mr. David Abdulla, the political leader of the Movement for Social Justice. He's with me this morning via Zoom. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Kieran, and morning to all of your viewers and those who are following the live stream anywhere in the world.
Well, Mr. Abdulla, let me first ask, is there a distinction between a public health crisis and a public policy crisis if, as suggested, a public health crisis, that statement in itself will lead to the creation of public policy?
Well, when you speak about public health, would be in relation to policies dealing with public health. That will be a subset, a part of our overall public policy issue. And the reason why I said it's a public policy crisis is because we have to trace the root of our problem of crime and violence back many decades. And well, first of all, recognize that we have a culture of violence in our society, which culture came out of our experience of slavery and indenture. And while we emerged from those experiences and moved towards independence and, created a society that had law and order in the sense that there were relatively few murders and that kind of thing, there has always been an underlying culture of violence in our society, manifest in terms of things like domestic violence and abuse of children and so on. And therefore, in certain conditions, that culture of violence, which was simmering below the surface, has emerged. We also have to recognize that violence takes many forms. It is not just physical violence, but there's violence done by an economic system which marginalizes and excludes people from the process of them being able to have a decent life and being able to aspire to their children and grandchildren having a decent life. And that changed because we did have that, I would say, up until the 70s, where parents would work hard and then they would know their children would be better educated than they were and would move into better jobs than them. And then the third generation will get to university and so on and even do better or into business. What we have now is a breakdown of that process of social mobility. Now, that is not a public health issue. That's a failure of economic policies over the years with structural adjustment in the 80s, leading to the decimation of certain kinds of employment for certain kinds of communities, which led to the breakdown of those communities, breakdown of families as mothers migrated to the US and sent back barrels for their children, and so on. We have the problem of the education system, which was pointed out more than 30 years ago in the report by the West Indian Commission, Time for Action, where they were making the analysis, and it's public. I don't know if it's online, but I used to have a copy of that document, Time for Action, a major report authored by Sir Sridas Ramphal, Alistair McIntyre, and others, where they said that 30% or more of the children were failing CSEC. At fifth form, children were dropping out of school, children were not doing well in SCA. And when you therefore have so many young children at that time being failed by the education system, and that's continued up to recently. Last year, the ministry published the data for the failure rate for SCA and CSEC and so on. It was 40-50%. And now we have the numbers of children who have dropped out due to the pandemic. So over the last 30-odd years, we have lost not one but two generations. Remember Ella Adele sang The Missing Generation, where we've lost not one but two generations of young people who have been failed by the education system. Where did some of them end up? Some of them ended up, and it's really the grandchildren of those first generations that were failed that are the ones who are engaged in violent crime and that kind of antisocial behavior. So,
well, Mr. Abdulla, let me interject there for a moment. A couple of points that you've raised there, starting off with this culture for violence, and you broke it down, you gave a timeline. You said up until the 70s, we saw parents working very hard at ensuring that their children had a better education and a better life than they did. And then you referenced the decline of social mobility. But this culture of violence that you speak of, why hasn't anything been done And I'm asking that question because you alluded that nothing has been done to eliminate this culture. Why haven't we been able to separate ourselves from this culture?
Well, culture, which is really behavior, how people behave, is not an easy thing to change. So one would have had to recognize the need to change that culture, and to and people are now speaking about things like alternative dispute resolution, mediation, getting children to recognize how they have to deal with conflicts. And incidentally, I should to point out that the children of today who are less involved in sport and activities like that, where they have to engage one with the other and resolve conflicts in a non-violent way, because they're on phones and devices and that kind of thing. That process of socialization has also changed. So we also have to recognize that in the late 60s, early 70s, the young men on the blocks were reading progressive literature. They were reading Fanon and Che and so on. They were looking at what was happening in the countries in Africa engaged in the process of liberation. They were looking at what was happening with the whole idea of the third world and Walter Rodney and a new international economic order. All those things were happening, but that process broke down. So the young men on the blocks now are not doing that, but some of them are engaged in gangs, and therefore the peer pressure has changed. So a whole series of things have happened over the years. And there's one thing that the Prime Minister may have said that was correct in his opening remarks to the symposium that CARICOM had Monday and Tuesday. And he said that, we weren't paying attention to what was going on and so on. Now, I want to say that we were not paying attention for much longer than he may have alluded to, because some of us were in fact speaking about these things. The late Professor Dennis Pantin wrote about the social debt that was being created as a result of the debt crisis of the 80s and the structural adjustment policies that were being put in place. And he said, we're creating a social debt, and that debt we're going to pay a high price later on, and we're paying that high price for that social debt now. So we were just the elites in the society. So let me make that point. The elites in the society, those who control political power, respective political parties and so on, those in parliament, the technocrats who develop policy, many of them, the academics and the intellectuals, the business elites, not talking about the small business owner and the self-employed, I'm talking about those who control major parts of the economy. The elites in our society, those who Lloyd Best wrote about and described as the validating elites. The elites weren't paying attention. They didn't care, because the children of the elites were not going to suffer the fallout from the policies, because the children of the elites are not in remand yard for 10 and 15 years. And so the prison system, which replicates or makes someone who goes in as a relatively minor offender coming out as a hardened criminal, we were not paying attention to that, even though there was a commission of inquiry into the prisons, chaired by my father, incidentally, way back in the 70s when Eric Williams was Prime Minister. You were not yet even thought about at that time. And that report was done and was presented to the government of Dr. Williams in the 70s.
Well, do you think,
much of it,
do you think that such commission of inquiries and even the West Indian Commission's Time for Action report of 1991, do such commission of inquiries, do such reports even make any sense or bear any fruits if there have been this ignorance to what has been happening, even as suggested by the Honorable Prime Minister?
Yes, and we could come to more recent history. Professor Ramesh Josran has done many studies on crime and violence and youth at risk and so on. Professor Selwyn Ryan was commissioned, I think, by the partnership government to do a report on communities where there was an increase in crime and violence and so on. And more recently, Dr. Anthony Watkins was commissioned there was a committee looking at some of those communities where there are problems that have developed. So we have ignored the reports. In fact, the Watkins report has not even been made public, but we have ignored the reports. It comes back to the issue that the elites have not had the political will or interest to do anything about it because the children of the elites go to the best schools, quote unquote, the prestige schools. So they're not the ones who are failing the exams, you know. And even if they don't do well in the exams, then the parents will find the money to send them to a private university or find them a job somewhere in their businesses and so on. So, you know, we have failed as a society to address the problems over a long period of time. And that's what I'm saying is a failure of public policy with respect to the criminal justice system, public policy with respect to the education system, public policy with respect to the economic system. We have failed in those areas. That may have led to now a public health crisis where you have children who are abused, who are growing up in the context of violence and guns and so on. What is that doing to their psyche? We have victims of crime. What is that doing to them in terms of their mental health and in terms of fear and so many things like that? And of course, those who are abused children tend to become more prone to abusing others later on. If you grow up in the context of violence and people being killed at a young age, you almost become somewhat immune to that, and therefore killing becomes less of an issue for you. So we have gotten to the point where elements of the failure of public policy has now led to that issue of public health. But public health is just one element of the whole dimension.
Abdulla, on that note of public policy crisis, if the elites, who ironically are the ones that influence a lot of political decision-making, as well as politicians, have ignored these breakdown in society and even this culture of violence that you spoke of, who are the ones that are now responsible for creating public policy? Because if the ones who have ignored it are the ones who are supposed to be creating it, could there be any level of confidence in what they will create if it's only to benefit them politically?
Yeah, sure. Key question, central question. I think that is really the issue that we have to focus on with respect to the CARICOM Symposium on Crime and Violence. And of course, they identified it as a public health crisis. Many of the leaders, and I listened to many of them, if not all of them, did speak with a certain amount of conviction about the issues, and they addressed different aspects. They did speak about education and need for education reform. They did speak about institutional transformation and change, the criminal justice system, and many of the other things that I just mentioned. But the question, therefore, is, do they have the will to bring about the change? I think that is fundamental. And part of them, I don't have a lot of faith in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Let me not speak about other countries, but certainly I don't have a lot of faith that this government has the political will to do the things that are necessary, because the party that is in government has had such a long history of ignoring these issues, including in constituencies that they represent. And the opposition, I don't have faith in them either, because their attitude is just is inappropriate. I mean, they had a press conference on Sunday, and what did they say? They called on CARICOM leaders to tell the Prime Minister to remove the Minister of National Security. Now, really, I mean, can the government of Trinidad and Tobago tell Prime Minister Buckley or Prime Minister Gonzalez to get rid of this Attorney General or that Minister of Education? No, you can't. You can't interfere in other people's business like that. So that statement was just a foolish statement, and it is an indication of the kind of failure of the thinking of the opposition and lack of vision. So I don't have a lot of faith in terms of Trinidad and Tobago getting to grips in terms of our leadership. I heard the business community speak. I heard Mr. Sagwa speak on behalf of the private sector organizations of the Caribbean. I heard Mr. Charles Pashley speaking on behalf of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber. They made important statements, but have they demonstrated in terms of their business practice and how they operate as business, a willingness to change the economic model that we have in Trinidad and Tobago? No, they haven't. So it therefore requires citizens to be more aware and conscious at several levels. At one, people have been talking about citizens being aware and conscious of their own safety and protection and security
Well,
that is
Mr.
necessary.
Abdulla, on that point,
Yeah.
we focused a lot on politicians. We focused a lot on the elites in society. But we did mention actually society and the breakdown even within the home and within society by extension. But that last particular point, foolish statements, a lack of vision. Do you think that because society has become so accustomed to foolish statements and a lack of vision, a lack of critical thinking, that we ourselves have become ignorant and are very much just now accepting of whatever we receive? We do not set higher standards for ourselves. In fact, we make certain pleas born out of desperation. Is that where we've reached?
To some extent, yes. In other words, a lot of the calls, given the horrendous situation of home invasions and the murder rate and robberies and so on, and other kinds of violence, and the issue of the type of weapons that the criminals are using now, assault rifles, indiscriminate killing, and so on. Yes, people are doing things out of, and making statements out of desperation, calling for the death penalty to be resumed, for the state of emergency, for more people to get guns with firearm users license. So there's that kind of knee-jerk reaction as people try to respond to their immediate situation. And there's a certain level of, I suppose, cynicism and sense of hopelessness that, the only way to deal with this crisis is to try to protect yourself and your family. So it's very much focused on the individual. And calls to the commissioner of police and the government, yes, you make the calls, but you don't think anything's going to really be done about it. But you have to make the calls and make the demands. So I think we need to, and that now is where, we have to try to engage the communities and engage the population, as we're doing in this program. I want to thank you for the opportunity to do that, to have a serious conversation about it. Last night we had Tuesday Talk with the MSJ, and I had Commander Gavin Kira, as an independent thinker and person expert, speaking about what he thinks is necessary to deal with crime and violence. So we need to do far more in terms of information, of educating, and so we raise the bar, the point you're making, raise the bar of our own understanding of what has to be done, so that the national community, citizens, civil society, can not only advance solutions, but put the pressure on the decision makers, be they the controllers of political power, the controllers of economic power, intellectuals, academics, and so on, technocrats, put the pressure on those who have decision-making power to change what they have been doing. And I was hearing some of the concerns by, prime ministers from across the region, that they recognize that this is a tipping point and that they have to get their act together.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Abdulla, forgive me, we don't have much time, but
much time. Yes,
I very quickly need to ask you, one of the ways that we can put pressure on any institution is through educating the public. I've always believed that education is a very powerful tool, and through education, are there any suggestions so that the public themselves can start thinking? Are there any suggestions for public policy, perhaps that is being proposed by the MSG?
Yeah, we outlined about 10 points in our press conference on Sunday. I'll try to run through them very quickly. One is the Financial Intelligence Unit, because we have to deal with white-collar crime and corruption. So the Financial Intelligence Unit should be taken out of the Ministry of Finance as a separate unit with legislative power to be able to investigate, issues of suspicious transactions, so that evidence is obtained, so that we could get people prosecuted and charged. We need to engage party finance legislation and campaign finance legislation, procurement legislation. I have proposed on behalf of the MSJ that all members of the Defense Force, Police Service, BIR, Customs, and so on, ought to undergo lie detector tests, because we have to weed out corruption within the agencies of state that have to deal with that. Major reform of the education system. Children, not only in terms of curriculum, but children should be at home until later in the afternoon, so that when they get home, their parents are at home, so that there's parental supervision. And rather than the young people being left to go on the block and be influenced by bad peer pressure. There are other issues that deal, for example, with more social workers and guidance counselors to be in our schools and in the communities so that we can move people out of poverty, household by household, and to deal with issues in the schools so that we can, deal with young people who are having problems and help them to resolve those problems at a much earlier age. Others I've heard talk about making sure that we have excellent universal preschool education, because that is vital to children and therefore human development. And there are other reforms that we have proposed, and the time is running out. But certainly we advocated about 10 areas. The criminal justice system, we have to get rid of preliminary inquiries and speed up the process of getting persons who are charged with a crime, convicted if they're guilty, so that both the victims of crime and the alleged perpetrators can have justice. Justice delayed is justice denied. We have to have a proper forensic science center, and so that DNA and ballistic evidence can be properly obtained and used in modern criminal
Mr.
proceedings,
Abdulla,
and so much more. There's much more.
Must apologize, but that's the time that we have for this morning's conversation. But certainly
Thank you.
lot to unpack, and welcome anytime to the program to continue this discussion. But for now, I will have to end it there. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you for giving me the time. Appreciate it.
Keep well. All the best.